Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. This is the latest edition of Drezburt. I am Daniel Drezner, a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. I also write the Spoiler Alerts blog at the Washington Post. And because yesterday was the last day of vacation and one last fit of protest, you were seeing me wearing a T-shirt and unshaven.
Gosh, and I'm missing that. I'm Heather Hurlburt, senior fellow at Human Rights First. And because basically my part of Washington kind of skipped August this year, I am in the office in full dress, heels, the whole routine, and my kid is back in school already.
I'm sorry, Heather. I apologize.
Anyway, however, despite all this, I'm on vacation pretense, Professor Drezner has enlivened us today with some questions or thoughts about an announcement that's nominally about climate change, but actually about says a lot about the politics of foreign policy writ large, which is that the Obama administration's gambit for international rulemaking on climate change is now, rather than trying to negotiate and pass a new treaty, to develop a hybrid document for UN approval that would combine legally binding elements from previous treaties with new commitments that would be politically binding. And Dan, you expressed some skepticism about this as an approach.
Right. So, the argument is that the logic that the Obama administration puts forward, which is not an unreasonable one, is to say, look, there is no chance in hell we are going to get any actual climate change treaty to get two-thirds support in the Senate. That's certainly true before the midterms. That will probably very much be true after the midterms. And yet the administration has been reasonably committed to trying to push forward on climate change cooperation at the international realm. One of the things they did earlier this year was, and in the past, was authorize, basically give the EPA authority to regulate based on this. So it's an example of the administration using its executive power without having to consult with Congress. So that's basically what they're proposing to do, some sort of mix of honoring pre-existing commitments that were passed by the Senate, namely the 1992 Rio Treaty, along with a couple of other measures that I believe the quote was will be politically binding as opposed to legally binding. The reservations I have on this, in some ways, as you say, this is part of a larger piece about the ways in which domestic gridlock affect the ability of the administration to conduct foreign policy, which is this administration has had almost no luck whatsoever getting the Senate to ratify any kind of treaty. The last one, I believe, was START 3, or New START, with Russia, which is not going to be pointed out by anyone as a real political victory. This is a Senate that won't ratify a truly anodyne UN disabilities treaty or the Law of the Sea Treaty, so you can forget anything with respect to climate change. Now, the argument that they would probably put forward is that climate change is really, really, really important, that this is a way of generating forward progress without having the dead weight that is the U.S. Congress. The concern I expressed is twofold. The first is, and whether or not this will simply encourage even further escalation by the Congress to try to hamstring the Obama administration. Even before this announcement was made, we saw Mitch McConnell being interviewed, in Politico, and he also told a private group of donors that, his strategy, should the Republicans win the Senate, was to attach sufficient policy riders on budgetary bills to basically force the president to either shut down the government or accept whatever those policy riders are. And one regulatory agency he singled out in particular was the EPA. Now, this was all before this announcement or, this leak to the Times. I can only imagine what other things Congress will try to do to hamstring the administration on this. And as you say, this is part of a larger sort of spiraling dynamic between Obama and the Republicans in Congress, whereby, even simple things that, ordinarily in previously bitterly opposed or divided government got passed are becoming really tough to do now. And so I understand the motivation for why the Obama administration is doing this. I'm just not sure the long-term payoff is going to be worth it.
Well, I disagree with you both about what this is connected to and what difference it'll make at home. And just to take the second point first, because it's
Okay.
easier. If Mitch McConnell is reelected and if he is Senate Majority Leader, both things I would think there's a decent to good chance of.
Yeah.
Number one, will he actually do that? And number two, will his calculus on whether or not to do that have anything to do with international rulemaking on climate change? I think the answer to that is no. That calculus is going to be driven by domestic politics and domestic issues, and this will provide, sort of one more thing to yell about, but it is absolutely not going to be the driving factor. So that shouldn't be what the administration bases its decision making on. Now, the sort of more interesting point, which you cite, I think, correctly in your piece, is that there is a bigger trend away from interest in reliance on or faith in legally binding treaty obligations. You see it in the Bush administration, which actually wanted to do an arms control deal with Russia that was not going to be legally binding. And
Right.
which was very funny when you saw the opposition to New START from some of the same people who said, "Oh, no, we don't need a treaty to do a deal with the Russians. We can just do it with a handshake." It all looks very funny now. So you do have, and to be fair, at the same time as you have a wing of the Republican Party that really believes that all treaties are implements of the devil and are unconstitutional attempts to impose, foreign rule on us. You also have, I think, real questions about the international community's ability to negotiate things that are both that are universal, legally binding, and useful. So even if you didn't have the craziness in Congress that you do, I believe, we're going to see fewer and fewer of those big global treaties, and they're going to be less and less useful. And, that to me is a bigger question about the effort to update a climate treaty that's going on, which is a little bit, the particular problem with the U.S. Congress is a little bit of a sideshow to that. And I also, it's important to point out that even when administrations and Congresses were collaborating decently well on other issues, you do have this just determination not to pass treaties. So again, this is a phenomenon that policymakers need to think about. We're sort of entering a new phase, I think, a new phase in the declining relevance of the UN, which is maybe an odd thing to say in year 6 of a Democratic presidency, but you do see it, and not just with respect to treaties, but frankly, this question of, it's actually kind of important from a global governance point of view that there are hybrid models that can work, and not just because of the U.S. Congress.
Okay, so a few responses. First, on the Congress thing, I think my concern is not so much, I don't think McConnell is going to change his behavior based on what the Obama administration has proposed. Or let me rephrase that. I think that this just simply further goads the Republicans to engage in further escalation in terms of finding ways to sabotage the administration. And I will say here that there is this exquisite hypocrisy that the Congress does on this, particularly with respect to foreign policy, which is that simultaneously they are asking the administration, why won't you lead, damn it, on various, trouble spots, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And yet, if the administration actually engages in sort of executive branch or executive action without bypassing Congress, they will nevertheless carp and complain about, this imperial presidency run amok. I think immigration would probably be the best example of that, actually, where simultaneously they're calling for the administration to do something, and yet they don't like it when something is actually done. So that's acknowledged. I'm just worried that this will simply exacerbate that even further. And, if we're operating in a world where the House can decide to sue the president, I'm just sort of curious as more and more sort of informal norms. And let's face it, that's part of the reason. Jonathan Chait's made this point repeatedly, and I think he's right about this, that part of the reason that the system of American government actually works is that there are these sorts of, beyond the actual Constitution, there are these sort of informal norms of, yes, eventually we're going to pass a budget, and eventually we have to do certain things like, fill executive, vacancies and so on and so forth. And there will be some deference to the executive branch when they appoint, deputy secretary of state and so forth. If those things erode, the relationship between the two branches becomes even more litigious. And I don't mean to say that therefore this is all Obama's fault. I'm just saying this is yet another, scab that's going to be picked at. So on that point, I'll take your point that this might not matter much on the end, but I think it's more emblematic of a worsening trend. The more interesting point, you're right, is this sort of global governance thing. This actually ties in to a book that I wrote over the summer called The System Worked, arguing that, in fact, the system did a pretty decent job in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. But when I talked about the system, I wasn't just referring to the sort of traditional multilateral universal membership organizations like the United Nations or the IMF or the WTO, but also these sort of club-based organizations, like the G20 or the G7 or what have you. And I think you're right that part of what's going on is that increasingly these universal membership organizations, the number of veto players is going up. And for example, India being able to basically, stop dead in its tracks a relatively useful trade facilitation agreement that had been negotiated by the WTO at Bali at the end of last year, that's a data point in your favor. I'm a little more optimistic on climate change, though, because in some ways we've been moving towards this anyway. I mean, in 2009 in Copenhagen, the actual, agreement that was reached was actually not sort of a UN thing. It was a much more informal arrangement among the sort of major emitting countries. And it strikes me that there might be grounds for a bargain to be struck this time as well, because the European Union obviously will be enthusiastic about it, but increasingly you're actually seeing China taking climate change seriously. And if you were to actually get an agreement involving the US, the EU, and China, that's, that ain't beanbag, as the phrase would go. So you're right that there should be more flexibility in being able to negotiate these things. The interesting question really is, let's assume this gets negotiated and inked. What happens if a Republican president comes on in 2017?
Well, I think that just the one pushback I would make to that is we saw under the W. Bush administration that there was no reluctance to actually back out of formal legal treaty obligations. Hold on. No, hold on. Let's be careful here. I agree with you that the Bush administration was hardly an enthusiast of these things. The only one they pulled out, the only one they actually withdrew from was the ABM treaty with Russia. The other two that you're thinking of, the ICC and Kyoto, the U.S. was never going to ratify. Well, actually, the only one I was thinking of was the ABM treaty, and that was one more arms control treaty than the U.S. had ever backed out of in the past. So that was that was a big moment. And, I also think with respect to the ICC that there was, not just, as you say, the U.S. wasn't going to ratify it, but there was the famous invading the Hague resolution in Congress and so on. So on the other, so this, sort of gets to my question to you. How interested a next administration is going to be in backing out of something, to me, is wholly dependent on what it is and how useful it is to U.S. business. So who will be defending it, basically. Yeah. And if it's defensible enough that it slides down the list of priorities of things to undo, if you will, then it'll get left alone regardless of what its legal status is. And so then that raises the question of what kind of deal are you trying to do?
That's possible, although I will say this strikes me as exactly the kind of thing that a Republican president on day one of their presidency would sign an executive order rescinding. Because it's exactly the kind of sort of symbolic feed to the red meat, or red meat sort of action that would, say, look, I got elected in part based on this mandate. This is therefore one of the things I'm going to do.
Okay, so now you imagine that you and I are on the transition team of an elected Republican president. And imagine that it is President Christie or President Rubio or President Jeb Bush, all of whom are, individuals who...
I'm sorry, I just had to laugh. Go ahead.
I don't know what you're laughing at. But
I can't take any of these people seriously at this point. That's my problem.
But no, you should. because those are all smart grown-ups who do understand that the science. Number one, they understand the science behind climate, Number two, they understand the realities of global politics. And number three, they're friends with the kind of global big business leadership in the U.S. who are more than a little tired of the crazy being imposed on them.
I will absolutely concede that last point. No, I'm sorry. It's the end of summer giddiness. Go ahead.
Come on, this is fun. You're sitting around. Yes. You're sitting around over steaks and martinis, which is how I imagine Republican transition teams work, as opposed to Democratic transition teams.
Replace martinis with scotch, but go ahead.
Okay, that's good. I was assuming it was the middle of the day and that one doesn't drink scotch in the middle of the day, but maybe you do drink scotch in the middle of the day.
Sorry, I keep interrupting you. Go ahead.
Yes, and I'm going to come right back to you every time, so just keep going.
Okay.
But so you say, okay, so once the red meat, we have to throw the base on day one, and you say, we can reinstate the gag rule on funding for family planning providers who also support abortion.
Right, the Mexico City policy. Yep.
We can reverse the executive order that President Obama did very shortly after getting into office, which banned extraordinary interrogation methods. We can rescind this climate agreement. I'm sure there's a couple of other big obvious things that I'm not. We can bomb a bunch of places where we think Obama wasn't bombing vigorously enough. Of all of those, there's only one that business might care about, and that's predictability on climate. So if you're, again, you're sort of Dan Drezner, centrist, and you're sort of like, all right, well, which one of these do I have to give you? Red meat people? I'm going to pick one of the other ones. So that's my only point.
And look, if I were advising President Rubio or Christie or President-elect Rubio, Christie or Bush, I would make that recommendation. In some ways, this is a genuine question over what. In some ways, it really does depend on whether someone gets elected in 2016. Because I think if, let's say, Hillary runs and she gets elected in 2016, presumably this policy would persist, and by the time 2020 rolls around, it would kind of be the cake would be baked. In some ways, this comes down to a question about exactly who runs the GOP if there is a GOP elected president, because you're right. The thing you'd recommend would be the Mexico City policy. That's the one that would probably feed the base the easiest. And you would recommend against this, but it depends to some extent on the nature of the campaign going forward and how high profile this was, and also, frankly, how important West Virginia is to the GOP coalition. Well, I mean, there are. Let me put it this way: there are, even 10 years ago, there were things that George W. Bush did that clearly flouted international agreements because he was conscious about how he got elected and how he wanted to get reelected. Think about the steel tariffs, for example, that were unilaterally imposed. It wouldn't shock me if this became part of that list, is all I'm saying. Well,
we will see. We will see what the list is, and when the GOP calls you to offer advice, I trust you will remember how I coached you.
I will try to do my best. I am confident the GOP is not going to be calling me anytime soon.
His centrist pretense finally drops.
Yeah.
So should we move on? I mean, because
yes.
I'm sure I have to say it's been delightful for me to talk about this issue because I'm spending most of my time talking about Ukraine and/or ISIS these days. But we have to give our corporate overlords what they want. So
right. I want to talk about ISIS, and I want to ask a question of you because in some ways I've been following the debate on ISIS a little bit, and it strikes me that the manner in which it's taking place is I think would flow into your area of expertise as someone who is much more well-versed in Beltway jargon than I am, because it strikes me that there is this kind of odd kabuki theater going on with respect to the debate about ISIS, which is, so on the one hand, let's face it, it's this group that genuinely does pose a real threat to the region, in the form of it actually holding territory and men and materiel and, for that matter, U.S. equipment in both Syria and Iraq. And over the course of the summer, the administration has gone from we are not putting any ground troops in Iraq to putting some special forces on the ground in Iraq and engaging in airstrikes against ISIS as a way to reclaim some territory. But over the last sort of week, there's been a palpable shift in the rhetoric coming out of Washington, namely, Chuck Hagel and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Martin Dempsey, both basically implying that if there is going to be – implying two things. The first is that ISIS represents a 9/11 type threat to the United States. And second, that any strategy to deal with ISIS will have to deal with Syria as well as Iraq. And so, for the first time, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, the president authorized, overflights of Syria to gain intelligence on ISIS. I think yesterday or today they rejected the Assad regime's offer to coordinate on ISIS. But I'm starting to see, the status quo shifting towards the idea that the U.S. will intervene not just in Iraq but in Syria to try to contain the ISIS threat. And I guess I have two questions for you. The first is there any actual evidence that ISIS represents the same threat to the United States that, let's say, Al-Qaeda did in terms of 9/11? And second, is this a sort of laying the groundwork, all of this sort of, for the past week going on, laying the groundwork for the president to come out and say, yeah, we're going to go to war against ISIS, or we're going to conduct very aggressive operations that might not include boots on the ground, but it will include basically everything else?
So I'm going to not answer your questions by not necessarily answering your questions, but here are things that
you are so well versed in the Beltway.
Oh, so first thing I want to say about this is I recommend to everybody a fabulous blog post by Brian Fishman of the New America Foundation, basically scolding everyone involved in this conversation for speculating about a lot of things they don't know about, and conducting the conversation at a really dumb level, even by inside Beltway standards. So Brian's piece is fabulous and bracing, and I recommend it. Now, having prefaced my comments with that, look,
violate them.
We will be hitting targets in Syria within a month. The U.S. will be hitting targets in Syria within a month, and I'll be shocked if it's not more like 2 weeks.
Okay.
And that signal from Hagel and Dempsey was very clear. The reason that the U.S. will be hitting targets in Syria within 2 months, or 2 weeks, I think, is actually a little separate from your other question. It is purely that there is no border there anymore. So anybody you've identified in Iraq who's a target doesn't magically become not a threat anymore because he strolls over the border to Syria.
Absolutely.
So, there are huge international law. I mean, this it goes back to our previous conversation, because one thing you're not hearing much of anybody other than international human rights lawyers say is, well, actually, we can't hit Syria because there's no legal, unlike in Iraq where the Iraqi government has said, please come help us.
Right.
There's no legal justification, but you do not hear anyone in Congress expressing much concern about that. So you could feel the necessity to hit Syria without escalating what it is the U.S. is trying to do to ISIS. So that's sort of point one. Point two, there's not so much kabuki theater going on as there is a massive internal debate going on. And massive internal debate is, I shouldn't even say internal debate because it's being conducted by Kerry and Hagel making press statements to some extent. But it's
a public internal debate.
It's a public internal debate. Thank you. So is the administration trying to defeat ISIS? Is the administration trying to contain ISIS? Is the administration trying to roll back ISIS? Is the administration trying to do some of those things in Iraq and others of those things in Syria? Is the objective the same in both places? And not just, Washington has to agree internally on the objective, but then because the U.S. can't actually do this alone and it can't do it without sort of other regional powers and non-state powers providing the ground troops, what's the objective that you can get the neighbors and other great powers with air forces to buy off on? So this massive debate is happening all over the place, in public, in private, with Congress, without Congress, with allies, without allies, with Turkey, with the Saudis. So if it seems really messy and confusing, that's because it is.
Okay. I am going to push you, though, on the question you didn't answer me, which, again, as I said, when I described you as well-versed in Beltway, I mean, I want an answer to this question. If you don't give it to me, I understand. But I'm going to push you one more time, which is, what evidence, if any, is there that, in fact, ISIS is the threat to the United States that Hagel and Dempsey said.
Okay, thank you. I truly actually had just forgotten that in the list of questions, so I'm really but the short answer is the Brian Fishman answer. We don't really know. Okay. So things that we think we know, things that we seem to know, there's somewhere, depending on which leak you believe, between 100 and 300 American citizens, so people holding passports that entitle them to come and go here quite freely, who are fighting in Syria. Plus some considerably larger number of people with European and other passports, which probably allow them to come and go here pretty frequently. So that's data point number one. Data point number two is that ISIS is very interested in giving us and Europe the impression that it's coming for us, so that there's a lot of rhetoric, a lot of very sophisticated use of social media, to say, see you in New York, see you in Washington, and all that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So, intention and capability aren't the same thing, but also you have to notice that the intention to make us think this, at least, is there. Third point is that a number of sort of really smart, experienced strategists have come from other franchises of the jihadi movement to ISIS. So they have means, they have motive, they have, if you will, human capital. And so that is reason, I think, to take the concern seriously. Now, did some of the rhetoric that's coming from Hagel and Kerry in particular maybe get a little over the top? Do we have any evidence that anybody has the actual ability to get on a plane and come here and do anything particularly large-scale damaging? No. So, again, the rhetoric doesn't match what we know about the reality. I think one way one can understand that is to think about the torrent of criticism that has been unleashed on the Bush administration for, quote, ignoring, unquote, warnings leading up to September 11th. And so if you're, and the Clinton administration too, to be fair, the torrent of critique goes that far back. So if you are an office holder right now, you're saying to yourself, well, the one thing I don't want to do is lowball this threat, especially when, we called it the JV, we lowballed it and called it the JV team earlier. So there's definitely some kind of, oversetting of expectations. But, that's also frankly a problem because, what's one reason that these guys are using all these very sophisticated social media techniques, and why are they putting people all over YouTube saying, hey, America, see you in New York? It's exactly to look like the center and the leadership and the greatest thing ever in jihad, and to sort of ease recruitment. And so when we say, oh my God, yes, this is bigger than Al-Qaeda, we're actually helping them with their regional goal.
Yes. This is why I'm questioning the use of that rhetoric. And not to make, again, I understand how ISIS represents a threat to our interests in the region. It's the 9/11 thing where, I don't disagree about the political optics of this as you're talking about. It's just, I have a very disturbing sense of deja vu listening to the rhetoric on this in terms of justifying U.S. action from, let's say about 11 years ago. So,
I want to challenge us actually one level deeper than that, because what we sort of a thing that we haven't solved since 9/11 is that there has to be an area between, worse than Al-Qaeda and not a threat to the U.S.
Absolutely.
And these guys, I don't have a security clearance. There's lots I don't know. I flunk Brian Fishman's, intelligent critique test. But again, if you look at these guys, admitting that we have a problem is the first step to recovery. But if these guys have the potential to pose a real threat. And so I want to be able to talk about that in a way that doesn't either fall into, oh my God, threat code red, don't let your kids go to Washington on a field trip, but that also doesn't fall into, not that big a deal.
Okay, so then I guess my follow-up question is this, which is, the U.S. strategy in Iraq right now to combat ISIS makes a great deal of sense. That, the argument is, look, we've been asked by the local government to participate. U.S. air power probably can make a difference given the terrain in Iraq. There are local proxies on the ground in the form of the Iraqi Defense Forces and the Peshmerga from the north to actually be able to successfully push back ISIS. Syria is a completely different, which is not to say we shouldn't do something on Syria, but it's just I don't understand. The only plausible option it struck me in Syria would be to say we have to choose the devil we know over the devil we don't, and therefore cooperate with the Assad government because that actually is the one force on the ground capable of potentially defeating ISIS. And yet I'm pretty sure we just explicitly rejected that option either this morning or last night. So it's not obvious to me, therefore, if you acknowledge that this is a threat that has to be dealt with in Syria, if you've rejected the most plausible option, what are the remaining options?
Okay, so bear with me as we walk through this in stages. So in Iraq, it's not clear to me that the U.S. has committed to defeating ISIS as opposed to containing and limiting ISIS. And
right.
Part of that is you cannot drive ISIS out of the Sunni strongholds if you don't have an Iraqi military whose authority is recognized in the Sunni strongholds.
Right.
And, we're making some progress with having a more representative Iraqi government, but nobody thinks we're there yet. And so I think the administration is not going to commit itself to a goal. It's not, we can't be committed to fight to the last Iraqi. So, as long as your goal is to contain and limit ISIS, you can't actually contain and limit ISIS in Iraq if they have complete freedom to go over the border and regroup in Syria and resupply and recommission and bring in new recruits through the Syrian border anytime they want. So you actually, even a limited goal in Iraq, if there is functionally on the ground no difference between Iraq and Syria in that region, even that limited goal is not going to work for you without, and I think this is what the administration's thinking, is without being able to at least, disrupt ISIS in Iraq's ability to get resupply from ISIS in Syria. So that's kind of,
okay.
That's kind of, you're stuck. You're going to have to do at least something in Syria. So then second,
right.
What do you do in Syria? So if your goal is only to prevent ISIS from taking over more of Iraq or prevent ISIS from having a functional state within Syria from which it can export violence, then you don't need Assad for that, is the theory. Now,
You can't see me rolling my eyes right now, but I just want you to imagine that. Go ahead.
No, but tell me, because the thinking is, you don't need to be able to defeat ISIS. You only need to be able to manage them. And, the other all of this sort of glibness about, we could cooperate with Assad. Well, number one, Assad would have loved to be capable of defeating the insurgent strongholds and hasn't been. Now I acknowledge that he's been mostly choosing not to fight ISIS up to now. When ISIS tries to take an airbase, he fights it. Otherwise, he buys oil from it. So the idea that we have something that would enable Assad to win a civil war that he hasn't been able to win up to now, given that it's not like our assistance to the rebels has been so great that it assisted the rebels to win the civil war. So this idea that there's some sort of deal that could be struck, I think is it sounds great in game theory, but there's just not a lot of evidence for it in reality.
That's a fair point. I guess I have a few thoughts. The first is, and I know the power of analogy is occasionally flawed, but I swear to God, the description you're giving me reminds me so much of Vietnam and Cambodia, it scares the crap out of me. The notion that, during the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese were always able to, through the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Cambodia, resupply forces in Vietnam. There's a disturbing parallel here, which is not to say that you're wrong, that if you're going to deal with ISIS in Iraq, you're going to have to at some point deal with the ISIS in Syria. I'm just pointing out that it gives me the heebie-jeebies. The second thing is that even if the only way I see this working is if there is somehow some kind of tacit agreement between the Assad government and the United States that if the U.S. decides it is going to either launch special forces drone strikes or air power against ISIS in Syria, that Syrian air defenses are not going to do anything about it. Because otherwise you're potentially going to have a problem there.
Well, can I just stop you on that particular point? Because we now know of at least one instance where the U.S. did send a special forces team into Syria to try to get James Foley, and for all the other problems that mission seems to have had no problem with Syrian air defenses. So there's an interesting separate question about whether Syrian air defenses have been somewhat exaggerated and are somewhat less of a huge concern than we were all being assured that they were this time last year.
But I think the other question, and this is really the thorny one, is can air power, as we're talking about, in and of itself, contain ISIS? And let me add one follow-up, which is, and this flips around the criticism I was offering before, but I can do that.
Do I contradict myself? Very well, then.
Yeah. So what? No, but let's say you're right that ISIS has capabilities that do not rise to 9/11 levels, but are clearly of concern, and we should voice that. The moment, and we're doing that now, the United States now inserts itself into this conflict directly, not through ground troops, but even through air power. Aren't we therefore encouraging a radical movement that actually has a base of operations to suddenly start focusing even more on the United States?
Yep.
So in other words, my concern is that the half measure of using air, if you're going to deal with ISIS, but your answer is it'll be a limited fashion where we just deal with air power and special forces, and this goes to your point about whether we're trying to roll them back, contain them, destroy them, or whatever. I'm not sure containing them is sufficient, because even if you contain them, you're still giving them a base of operations to organize and launch, presumably, a strike against, the U.S. somewhere.
So one can make the argument that the counterterrorism strategy that has been followed the last 6 years in Yemen, Somalia, to some extent Pakistan, has been to use air power to degrade terrorist organizations and command and control structures sufficiently that they can't pose long-range threats, but not sufficiently that they can't wreak havoc on the societies that they're embedded in. So, we haven't, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is not gone. The various extremist groups in Pakistan are not gone.
They're not gone.
But they haven't been successful in mounting an out-of-area operation that threatened, that harmed Americans. So, while not endorsing that strategy as a wise long-term way to conduct counterterrorism and win hearts and minds, because I don't think it is that, if you look at the region and you say, yeah, we can't beat ISIS, the Iraqi army can't beat ISIS, the Kurds can't beat ISIS, we can't solve the civil war in Syria, the Syrians can't solve the civil war in Syria, the Turks and Saudis won't solve the civil war in Syria, and the Russians won't stop meddling, then what is it that we do know how to do? We do know how to degrade things enough that there isn't a threat to the homeland. And then that's what you do. And I think, that is an ugly, ugly thing. But
you're basically saying that we are acting like the global version of Israel. Because essentially, the strategy you've described of how we're dealing with all of these groups is almost perfectly mirrors what Israel has done with respect to Hamas.
Yeah, I'm not going to go there. You are welcome to say that.
I am going there. That's you've basically described that. And I'm not. We will let the good commenters at Blogging Heads take that analogy and
No, in all seriousness, actually, I do think it's quite different to have the threat right on your door.
Yeah.
I think as much as I'm uncomfortable with the strategy I've just described from the American perspective, I actually think it is more defensible purely from a strategic point of view. There's more ways that it makes sense when you conveniently have a couple of bodies of water between you and the places than when, the folks are right, in among you. So I don't actually, either in terms of goals or in terms of strategic wisdom, and I'm very explicitly leaving aside moral wisdom in both cases, but yeah, the point is a provocative one, as is, by the way, I don't want to ignore it and be accused of playing the Beltway thing again. Your Vietnam and Cambodia reference is also very provocative and deserving of thought. I'm not sure how can I say this? It doesn't make me change my point of view that I don't really see how you deal with ISIS in Iraq if you're letting them do whatever they want in Syria. Yeah. On the other hand, the historical precedent is an unnerving one.
Yes. No. I'm not saying, I've warned repeatedly about the dangers of using analogical reasoning in world politics, but that said, this makes me uncomfortable.
So you realize that some student of yours is gonna, the next time you criticize for analogical reasoning in study of world affairs, is gonna play that clip, right? That's my one consolation for sitting here and saying you raise a good point that I don't have an answer for, is the consolation of knowing some student is gonna zing you with that.
I'm sure they will. On the other hand, the nice thing about blogging heads is that we're not graded. But we should probably segue to our last topic, which is ongoing developments in Ukraine. And I confess, because I've been on vacation, I've missed what's happened in the last 24 hours. I know that Putin and Poroshenko have met, and I know that the Ukrainians are now accusing Russians, regular Russian forces of actually crossing the border. I don't know how many have crossed and whether there's actually been significant territorial, occupation. But besides that, I'm ready to talk about that.
Yeah. So just, by the time this is posted, these things will be much clearer than they are to either of us right now in terms of I've been seeing words like overrun for various regions today, but, it's a mix. It looks like there are now visibly more regular Russian forces in among the irregulars, volunteers, locals than there have been in the past. There was also a couple days ago, the display on Ukrainian TV of some captured Russian paratroopers. It should be noted that it was a display of captured Russian paratroopers who had clearly been beat up. So, lest we fall into the trap of acting like one side is angels and the other is not. But, Russia has over the last couple of weeks just steadily upped the ante, putting more troops on the border, firing over the border, moving inside the border to fire, sending in this quote unquote humanitarian convoy, sending forces in from a different border than the previous one where the focus had been. And then you have this meeting in Belarus yesterday where, Putin gives no ground on the economic, this meeting is nominally on the economic side and gives no ground on that either. And just, seems to be, the plan seems to be to squeeze Ukraine harder in every manner. And I think, the worrisome thing here is I have not yet seen an analysis that I bought as to what Putin's end game is. Is the end game just eventually to take and I've been saying for a while that the confident assertions that, Putin is playing it by ear and he doesn't know what he's doing and he's overextended, people have to stop that. That Putin may be playing it by ear, but you know what? You could play it by ear in a country that's right next to yours and has a lot of your co-ethnics, and you can do that just fine. It's not a disadvantage. So Putin is not looking for an exit ramp in the sense that
that's
been described.
No. You're absolutely correct. But on the other hand, in some ways, what he's had to do over this past week actually represents a failure of his policy rather than a success of it. Because, it's clear that Putin thought that he would be able to create some, I don't know if it was either annex the territory or create some sort of autonomous republic in eastern Ukraine, as effortlessly as he did in the Crimea. And the thing that's happened over the last 2 months since Poroshenko was elected, is that the exact opposite has happened. That in fact, Ukrainian government forces have, reclaimed something like 3/4 of the territory that the rebels held. They bisected them between Donetsk and Luhansk. Left to their own devices, it seemed pretty clear that the Ukrainian government was going to be able to reclaim most of the territory, as this process was going on, despite the fact that Russia was upping the amount of weapons and upping the amount of, men that it had been sending into the area. So I think in some ways the question is whether this latest effort will actually succeed in, the rebels reclaiming some of their lost territory. And I honestly don't know the answer to that. And I don't, because to be fair, the Ukrainian government forces have probably improved somewhat their performance over the last couple of months. I think the more interesting question is, as you said, I think Putin's strategy is, I will squeeze Ukraine as hard as possible, and even though this might cost me significantly, it will cost Ukraine more, and eventually I will win. And I'm not sure about that bet. There are ways in which the Ukrainian economy is doing worse than the Russian economy at this point. But the Ukrainian economy is also smaller, and in some ways the one thing I think the United States and the European Union might be willing to commit to Ukraine is money to keep it open. They're not going to do anything else for a variety of reasons, but I think they are probably willing to bankroll Ukraine to keep it as an independent bulwark against Russia. So I'm not sure that Putin's strategy makes any more sense either.
Well, if you assume that what winning means is that Ukraine is firmly reestablished as a member of the post-Soviet space, if you will, as opposed to being a member of the EU space, then, at a certain point, and I think this is what has sort of gotten Western diplomacy in trouble up to now, and is the assumption that there was some compromise easily within reach about what that looked like. And, the message that I think the Europeans are being sent over and over is, the compromise is a lot further from your position than you think it is. Yes, just to whatever extent Brussels and Washington can bankroll Ukraine, although, given all the dynamics with Congress we talked about before, it'll be very interesting to watch the fight between the sort of Marco Rubio wing of the Republican Party and the Rand Paul wing of the Republican Party about how much money the U.S. should give Ukraine. And then, Ukraine's going to have trouble absorbing the money. It's going to have trouble using it well. It's going to be very hard to reform and deal with corruption while you're also fighting an insurgency. So, I'm just not sure. They can go for a long time. Russia can go for a long time before any damage to its economy comes anywhere near what they think they're gaining strategically, if you think about it.
I think I would say two things in response, and this might be why I'm more optimistic about the situation in Ukraine than you are. The first is that it is, in fact, the insurgency itself that actually might cause the Ukrainians to be able to actually engage in state building. You could argue that the Ukrainian state, for the 2 decades that it was independent before, the protests started last year, had basically been sort of sleepwalking in a sort of semi-corrupt manner, more democratic than Russia, but, sort of secure in the fact and the sovereignty that it had been given. It is this last year, the threat that Russia has posed, that actually could cause, the Ukrainian government to, it's when you're threatened with extinction that you basically have a choice at that point between reforming yourself or dying. And I suspect that there are sufficient, elements of Ukraine that have decided we don't want to be swallowed up by Russia to allow that they're going to have to reform themselves. So in some ways, Putin has actually midwifed the very thing he didn't want to create, which was potentially a Ukraine with an incentive to get its act together.
Well, I hope you're right. My fear is that by going from a Ukraine with an incentive to get its act together to a Ukraine that is militarily fighting for its existence, that you actually, it's very hard to do economic reform during a civil war or during any kind of war. So that's my source for pessimism, but I hope you're right. I'd rather you were right.
Right. No, and that's a fair point. And Ukraine has, without question, suffered economically more than Russia has over the last year. On Russia, it was interesting. I don't know if you saw this figure about Netanyahu's popularity, that it's sort of dropping like a stone because the conflict is continued to persist with respect to Gaza, and that it's now below 50%, even though 6 weeks ago it was above 85%. I think the really interesting question, and I don't have an answer to this, I would add, is at what point Putin's popularity starts to drop. Because if you actually take a look at the dynamics of Russian public opinion, it's actually pretty interesting. see Russia as in the right on the one hand with respect to the conflict in Ukraine. On the other hand, there is almost no enthusiasm whatsoever in Russia for an actual military occupation of Ukraine. And also, the Russian economy is beginning to sputter significantly as a result of foreign capital leaving the country. I've seen two arguments on this. The first is that this will eventually cause significant interests in Russia to begin to get discontent because Russia is now at the point where it's actually imposing its own sanctions in the form of banning food imports from the EU. But in doing so, they're hurting Russian consumers. So I'm kind of curious to see what the effect of that is. And over the long term, if the perception by Russians is Putin has gotten us into a war that it will be impossible to win, that the only thing that can continue to happen is essentially a stalemate, and we have no economic growth, well, what's the benefit from that? There is nationalism, I'm not denying that, but part of this is that I do think at some point Putin's popularity is going to be dropped, and then I wonder what he's going to wind up having to do. But that, Putin has more levers of propaganda at his disposal than Netanyahu does.
Well,
so it
Putin
might be
just has more levers, period. And I was going to say that thinking about how public opinion matters in Russian governance is enough to make you feel really warm and fuzzy toward Israeli democracy and American democracy by comparison. And one of the sort of self-reinforcing aspects of this crisis is that the more Putin gives his security establishment its head and the more he relies on the nationalist arguments for legitimacy, the less he needs public opinion, the less public opinion matters, even as, ultimately, as I agree with you that in the very long term, he is certainly sowing the seeds for discontent among certain sectors of the public anyway. But once you get this far into the dance with your security services, which also then poses a problem because if the only poll you care about is the poll of your armed services, that's going to give you some very different answers to questions about how far you go in Ukraine and when you pull back and, whether you go somewhere else after Ukraine, which is also a worrying thing to think about.
But I would add two things on this. The first is that part of the question is at what point do the armed services or the security forces begin to sour on this conflict? Because in some ways they've been hamstrung in terms of what they're going to do. And the further they push into Ukraine, the more they're actually going to suffer in terms of loss of life. I mean, one of the things that presumably the Russians have discovered is that, you could take Crimea. There was sufficient domestic support for, Russian annexing of Crimea. That's not true anywhere else in Ukraine. And the more aggressively they push, the more they're actually going to have to deal with the fact that it's a real war, not a sort of bloodless annexation. Now, it might be that there's enough Russian nationalism so that none of that matters. That, they'll be perfectly happy to annex this stuff. But I don't think it's quite that simple. But you're right that Putin can persist in this current policy for a long time. And so in some ways this becomes a question of, is it possible to wait out Vladimir Putin on Ukraine? And I don't have the answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, and just remember how long it took the Soviet military to sour on Afghanistan, where there was no the nationalist or co-ethnic tie. So I do think you are understating the role that plus just, I mean, again, Ukraine is right there and it has been closely allied with, if not subservient to, Russia for so much of both countries' history that it's not like just going to war in a neighboring country. So I think you're over optimistic, but
I will say that part of this comes from the fact, when I lived in Ukraine, let me put it this way, I think you're underestimating the extent to which Putin's actions in eastern Ukraine have actually radicalized the country, in a way that it didn't have to, wasn't happening even before that. I think you're right about the Russian view of Ukraine. The problem is that's not the Ukrainian view of Ukraine or Russia. And so I think in some ways part of what's going on here is a question of sort of which perception of Ukraine winds up winning out. And you're right that to some extent this country matters a lot more to Vladimir Putin. On the other hand, I actually don't think it will require that much commitment by Americans and Europeans to sort of at least aid the Ukrainians to the point where it winds up being a stalemate?
Well, I guess I'm not questioning your views of Ukrainians. I think the question is, I mean, because ultimately, look, I mean, there's two outcomes that are possible. One outcome is we reach some kind of stalemate / compromise where Ukraine is back to playing a go-between role in one way or another. And since let's be honest, they were never going to let it into the EU, much less NATO. So Ukraine is never getting fully out of Russia's orbit. So there is, so it's either that or Ukraine is dismembered. Those are your two options. So,
there is a third option, which is what I think is actually going to happen, which is it's not so much stalemate. There's going to be persistent conflict in eastern Ukraine. That's actually what I suspect is likely going to happen, which will obviously sap the Ukrainians. But my point is, it's actually going to sap the Russians as well. And it'll be interesting to see going forward what that means, and whether or not the U.S. and Europe will be willing to subsidize Ukraine to such a point that it can continue in that stalemate.
Well, and I would almost argue, I mean, that's not a good thing, because Russia being long-term involved in a conflict of this intensity is, as I suggested earlier, it's going to push Russian governance and Russian politics in unproductive, not the directions that those of us that wanted to see Russia increasingly tied to Europe and the West and a democratic player wanted to see.
Right, but I think that ship has sailed, I guess is my point, which is,
yeah.
in other words, I don't think, given where we are, I don't think there is a better outcome than that one, which is a depressing, statement, but nevertheless, true.
So,
I hear your phone ring.
Right. So, maybe on that note, see you next month, and we'll be able to check whether I'm right or wrong about, bombing Syria.
All right. As always, a fun time, Heather.
Thanks.